Alright, so we're going to graph this sine function right here, and I'm going to lay out the general strategy of going about doing so. So, in order to graph these types of functions here, a sine or cosine, it's helpful to find the amplitude, period, and phase shift. We're also going to look at y equals sine x and see if we notice any patterns that can help us out here. So take a note that with one cycle of the sine curve, we like to start at the middle line and then end on the middle line too. And then notice directly in between the first and last point here is also a point on the middle line. And then the rest is just the maximum point and minimum point here. So right in between the first and middle point is the maximum point here, and right in between the middle and last point is the minimum point here. And that's the format we're going to create when graphing this sine curve right here. So first, let's find the amplitude, period, and phase shift here. Now, I do have the formulas right here, and we can just use that to help us out. So our amplitude will be 3 here. And then our period would be 2 pi over 2, or just pi. And our phase shift will be negative pi over 2, all over 2, which would be positive pi over 4. We would also like to find our center line here, or excuse me, the middle line, which is given by this constant here, the plus 1. So let's just label that right now. 1 here. And we also know our amplitude is 3, so that means we can go above the middle line at 3 units or below 3 units. So here's our maximum line here. And then -2 will be our minimum. So first, we're going to start with the first point, which is at the phase shift right here. So our first point will lie on pi over 4. And then take a note here that our starting point for sine is at the middle line here. So our first point will be pi over 4, 1. All right, so now let's graph our last point, which would just be pi over 4 plus the period, which is pi here. And then once you combine these right here, you should get 5 pi over 4. So right here would be 5 pi over 4. And that should be a point right on the middle line, just like in this sine curve right here. So now directly in between would be also the middle line here. But we just have to find, what's directly in between pi over 4 and 5 pi over 4. Now, if it's not immediately obvious, you can always take the average between the 2 points here. So let's take the average of pi over 4 and 5 pi over 4. So add those two up and then divide it by 2. So pi over 4 plus 5 pi over 4 is 6 pi over 4, all over 2. That reduces to 3 pi over 2, all over 2, which will give us 3 pi over 4. So in between pi over 4 and 5 pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4. So this is 3 pi over 4. And then remember what we said right here, that in between the first and the last point is also a point on the middle line here. So this is also on the middle line. So lastly, we just need to graph our maximum point and our minimum point here. So again, we just have to find what's in between pi over 4 and 3 pi over 4. And if that's not immediately obvious, you can always just add them up and then divide by 2. And if you just do the math here, then you'll get 2 pi over 4, or pi over 2. So this x-coordinate here is pi over 2. And again, between the first and the middle point will be the maximum here. And our max is 4. And then we repeat the process for 3 pi over 4 and 5 pi over 4. If it's not immediately obvious, you can always just take the average between these 2 points. So 3 pi over 4 plus 5 pi over 4 all over 2. Now if you just calculate that, that would be pi. And then you can notice here that we're going increments of pi over 4. And right between the center point here and the last point is the minimum point, which is at -2. And all is left is just connecting the dots here. And there you have it. We have one complete cycle of our sine curve right here of 3 sine of 2x minus pi over 2 plus 1. And you can always continue this if you want, as you please.